Everyone forgot her disappearance, until a storm revealed the truth. The wind howled through the trees with a fury that the small town of Millbrook hadn't seen in decades. It was 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in October when Hurricane Catherine finally lost its strength, leaving behind a trail of destruction that would forever change the lives of all residents. Broken branches scattered across the streets like fractured bones, and rain still dripped from gutters clogged with leaves and debris. But it was when the sun rose, painting the sky a pale orange that contrasted with the devastation, that Jim Morrison made the discovery that no one was prepared to face. Jim was a simple man retired from the city hall, who had the habit of walking every morning through Millbrook Park even after storms. He said he liked to see how nature recovered, how life always found a way to continue. That morning, however, his steps led him to an area he had never explored before. The storm had brought down an old century-old oak tree that stood at the park's edge, near the stream that ran quietly through the town. The exposed roots created an irregular hole in the ground, and it was there, among the wet earth and stones, that Jim saw something that made his heart stop. At first he thought it was a whitish branch. Then perhaps a piece of broken pottery. But when he crouched down to look closer, his hands trembled violently. It was a bone. Definitely human. And there were more. Many more. Jim ran home with a speed he hadn't shown in years, stumbling over branches and puddles, his heart beating so hard he could hear the blood pulsing in his ears. When he finally managed to dial the police, his voice came out broken, almost unintelligible. In less than an hour, the site was surrounded by yellow tape, and Little Millbrook was transformed into a police movie scene. Police cars, an ambulance, the county coroner, and dozens of curious onlookers crowding on the other side of the tape, whispering theories and speculations. But there was something in the air that morning, a tension that went beyond simple morbid curiosity. It was as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for an answer that everyone secretly already knew. Detective Sarah Chin was the first to arrive at the scene. She had moved to Millbrook only 2 years before, seeking a quieter life after decades working on violent cases in the capital. But when she saw the first bones being carefully excavated, when she noticed the fabric fragments still clinging to some pieces, and especially when she found that small crescent moon pendant, she immediately knew who it was. Everyone in town knew. Maggie Ellis. 17 years old. Missing for exactly 7 years, 2 months and 4 days. Maggie had the kind of presence you notice even when she's not trying to get attention. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was indeed beautiful, with brown hair that shone like copper when the light hit it just right, and green eyes that seemed to hold secrets. It was more than that. Maggie had an intensity, a way of looking at the world as if she were always searching for something more, something others couldn't see. Her parents, Robert and Linda Ellis, used to say she had fire in her soul, an expression they always made sound like half compliment, half concern. She lived on Elm Street in a light blue Victorian house that her mother had inherited from her grandmother. The house always seemed too big for a family of 3, with its empty rooms and corridors that echoed every step. Maggie spent most of her time in her attic room, which she had transformed into her personal sanctuary. The walls were covered with photos she had taken herself, pieces of handwritten poetry, and posters of bands no one else in Millbrook knew. She had an old acoustic guitar she had bought at a bazaar, and on summer nights when the windows were open, neighbors could hear her soft voice singing melodies she composed herself. At school, Maggie was a paradox. Academically brilliant, always among the top of her class, but socially she kept her distance. Not because she was shy but by choice. She had a few close friends, but preferred to observe rather than participate in the games and teenage dramas that dominated high school. Her best friend was Emma Rodriguez, an equally introspective girl who shared her passion for photography and literature. Together they spent entire afternoons exploring the town's surroundings, looking for interesting places to photograph, or simply sitting on the lake pier, making up stories about the strangers who passed by. But Maggie carried wounds that not even Emma knew completely. When she was 12, her older sister Caroline had died in a car accident. Caroline was everything Maggie aspired to be: popular, confident, with clear plans for the future. Her death left a void in the family that was never filled. Robert began drinking more, and Linda got lost in a cycle of antidepressants and therapy that never seemed to work. Maggie, still a child, suddenly found herself emotionally caring for her parents, a weight no one should carry so young. Perhaps that's why she felt so attracted to older people, to situations that promised a maturity she felt she had been forced to develop too early. When she started working part-time at the town library at 16, she quickly became Mrs. Peterson's favorite employee, the head librarian. Maggie had a special way of dealing with books, as if each one were a personal treasure. She knew every section, every author, and had an impressive memory for recommending exactly what each visitor was looking for, even when they themselves didn't know. It was at the library that she met Marcus Webb. Marcus was 24, an occasional substitute teacher at the school, and was in town temporarily while finishing his master's degree in literature. He was the kind of man Maggie had never encountered before. Intellectual, well-traveled, with stories of distant places and ideas that made her mind spin. He talked about books she had never heard of, about philosophy and art in a way that made the world seem infinitely bigger and more interesting. What started as casual conversations about books quickly transformed into something more intense. Marcus began showing up at the library almost every day, always with a plausible excuse, but clearly interested in spending time with Maggie. She felt flattered by the attention of someone so sophisticated, so different from the boys her age who only talked about sports and video games. When he suggested they meet outside the library, she said yes without hesitation. Their meetings were always discreet. Marcus insisted it was better this way, at least until she turned 18. They met at cafes in the neighboring town, or walked isolated trails in the forest surrounding Millbrook. Maggie felt like she was living in a romantic movie, finally experiencing the kind of deep connection she had always desired. Marcus made her feel special, mature, as if she were the only person who truly understood him. But Emma began to notice changes in her best friend. Maggie was more reserved, more distant. She would cancel plans they had made, always with vague excuses. When Emma asked directly, Maggie would smile in a way that didn't reach her eyes and change the subject. It was as if she were keeping a secret that was consuming her from the inside. In fact, Marcus was becoming increasingly possessive. What had started as romantic conversations about literature and philosophy was transforming into something darker. He began questioning where Maggie was when they weren't together, who she was seeing, why she couldn't spend more time with him. When she mentioned that maybe they should slow down, that her parents were getting suspicious, Marcus had a reaction that scared her. He didn't yell, but there was something in his eyes, a coldness she had never seen before. "You don't understand what we have," he said with a low, controlled voice that was more terrifying than any scream. "You can't just throw this away as if it were child's play." Maggie began to realize that what she had interpreted as passion was, in fact, obsession. Marcus knew details about her life that she had never shared with him. He would appear in places where she didn't expect to see him, always with a plausible explanation, but which began to seem like too many coincidences. When she tried to confront him about this, he made her feel like she was being paranoid, as if she were the one with problems. It was then that Maggie decided she needed to end the relationship. She chose a day when she knew Marcus would be teaching at school, and left a letter at the library, explaining that she needed space, that everything was happening too fast for her. It was a gentle but firm letter. He hoped he would understand. Marcus didn't understand. On the night of March 15th, a Friday that promised to be the beginning of a quiet weekend, Maggie left home telling her parents she was going to meet Emma at the mall. It was a lie, but a necessary lie. In fact, she had arranged to meet Marcus, who had insisted they needed to talk in person. Against her better judgment, she agreed, hoping she could make him understand that she simply couldn't continue. They met in the empty parking lot behind the library, a place that had been special to them at the beginning of their relationship. The night was cold, with a breeze that made the dry leaves dance across the asphalt floor. Maggie arrived first, nervous, mentally rehearsing what she was going to say. When she saw Marcus's car headlights approaching, her heart began to beat faster. Marcus got out of the car slowly, and even in the dim parking lot light, Maggie could see that something was different. He was thinner, with deep dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't been sleeping well. When he approached, she could smell alcohol on his breath, mixed with the cologne he always wore. "You can't do this," were the first words he said without even greeting her. "You can't just discard me as if I were nothing." Maggie tried to keep her voice calm, but she could feel fear growing in her throat. "Marcus, I explained in the letter. I just need time to think, to grow. That doesn't mean you're not important." "Important?" His voice was rising, echoing through the empty parking lot. "I opened my heart to you, Maggie. I showed you parts of me I never showed anyone. And you think you can just decide you need time? The conversation quickly got out of control. Marcus began listing everything he had done for her, all the special moments they had shared, as if they were debts she needed to pay. Maggie tried to explain that it wasn't about not appreciating these things, but about feeling suffocated, about needing space to discover who she was without him. You're just a child, Marcus said finally with a cruelty that cut deep. A stupid child who doesn't know what she wants. It was at that moment that Maggie realized she had made a terrible mistake meeting him alone. The person standing before her wasn't the intelligent, sensitive man she had fallen in love with. It was someone she didn't recognize, someone who looked at her with a mixture of anger and desperation that made her want to run. I'm going home now, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. We can talk about this when you're calmer. But when she started to walk away, Marcus grabbed her arm. Not hard enough to hurt her, but firmly enough to make it clear he wasn't going to let her go easily. You don't understand, he said, and there were tears in his eyes now. You can't leave me. I can't live without you. What happened in the following minutes remained a mystery for 7 years. Neighbors who lived near the library would later say they heard loud voices, then the sound of a car accelerating quickly. But no one saw anything. No one thought to check. In a small town like Millbrook, couple arguments weren't uncommon, and no one imagined that something terrible was happening. When Maggie didn't come home that night, her parents initially weren't alarmed. She was 17, responsible, and sometimes stayed at Emma's house until late. But when they woke up Saturday morning and realized she hadn't slept at home, when they called Emma and discovered she hadn't seen her on Friday, panic began to set in. Robert Ellis called the police at 8 in the morning, his voice breaking when he had to say the words, "My daughter is missing." Linda was sitting in the kitchen, still in her pajamas, holding a coffee mug that was cooling in her trembling hands. The house, which had always seemed too big, now felt cavernous, every corner echoing with Maggie's absence. Millbrook's police department wasn't equipped to handle a missing person case. The town had a virtually non-existent crime record, and the 3 police officers who made up the entire department spent most of their time dealing with traffic violations and disturbing the peace. But they did what they could. They organized searches, spread flyers, contacted hospitals and police stations in neighboring towns. The first week was a whirlwind of activity. City volunteers joined the searches, walking through the woods around Millbrook, checking every abandoned barn, every forgotten trail. The case made it to local newspapers, then to regional TV stations. For a brief moment, it seemed like the whole world's attention was focused on finding Maggie Ellis. Marcus Webb was questioned, of course. He admitted he knew Maggie from the library, that they had talked a few times about books, but denied any romantic involvement. He seemed genuinely shocked by the disappearance, even offered to help with the searches. His story was consistent and there was no evidence linking him to the disappearance. Besides, he had an alibi for Friday night. He was at an education department meeting that lasted until 10 o'clock with dozens of witnesses. But Emma knew something wasn't right. She couldn't prove it, but she was certain Maggie was involved with someone. In recent months, her best friend had changed, becoming more reserved, more distant. There were small signs. Different perfume, a necklace Emma had never seen before, the way Maggie looked at her phone when a message arrived. She tried to tell the police about this, but without concrete evidence, her suspicions were treated as teenage speculation. As the weeks passed, the intensity of the searches diminished. Volunteers returned to their routines, journalists found other stories to tell. Robert Ellis took indefinite leave from work, spending his days creating and spreading new flyers, calling distant police stations, following leads that invariably led nowhere. Linda took refuge in her faith, spending hours at church, praying for a miracle that never came. Marcus finished the semester and left Millbrook, saying he had gotten a permanent position at a university in another state. No one thought much of it at the time. Substitute teachers come and go, especially in small towns. Millbrook's police department wasn't equipped to handle a missing person